Okay, how's everybody doing today? My name is Jay, and in this video today we're going to be talking about the About This Mac feature that you can find on your Mac or Apple product. Basically, the purpose of this video is just to give the beginner or the novice an idea of what's under the hood of your Mac, and for those of you who might have a better understanding of computing or computer architecture, just to give you more information, more details about your processor, your display, what your startup disk is doing, and just give you some good basic general knowledge of what's going on under the hood of your Mac. Okay, so this is my desktop. This is my MacBook Pro. We're going to go to the top left corner and click on the Apple icon. Now, the first selection that we will see is the About This Mac button, and we're going to click on that. So when we click that, we see a window that appears, and it's giving us a bevy of information on different details of the computer, what kind of operating system we're running, what kind of graphics card we have. And so this is the information that we're going to be diving into. So right off the bat, we can see that I'm running Mac OS Catalina version 10.15.6. So in 2001, Mac started producing the OS 10 operating system. They started the system, or they started this operating system with 10.0 Cheetah. That was the logo. That came out on January 9th, 2001. Since then, they've released 15 versions, as is evident in the 10.15.6. And the current iteration is called Catalina, and the actual iteration that I have is the 6th release or 6th update of Catalina. That's reflected in the 6th. And if you've noticed, if you pay any attention to Mac software at all, you'll notice that actually Catalina is not the most updated version. The most updated version is Big Sur, which was released in, or I should say on June 22nd of 2020. And it does seem like every year in June, Mac does release their new operating system. So if you're thinking about switching software or thinking about maybe switching operating systems altogether, it might make sense to be thinking of the time of year, since Mac tends to put out new operating systems in June. It's worthy to note that Catalina, the processor, is a 64-bit processor, and all applications are required to be 64-bit as well. If you don't understand this bit concept, let me explain it to you really quick. So the most fundamental unit in computing is called a bit. It's either a 0 or a 1, right? It's a binary unit. And then there's another unit called a byte, which is 8 bits, and that creates a byte, right? So you go from a byte to a kilobyte to a megabyte to a gigabyte. Now, mega refers to millions, and giga refers to billions. So if you have a 1 gigabyte hard drive, let's say, and there are 8 bits in 1 byte, you have 8 billion bytes, 8 billion bits in your 1 gigabyte. Interesting to think about. And you might think like, okay, well, what does that matter? What does it matter that it's 64-bit? Well, I'm not going to go into all the details, but you might be thinking like, okay, if I have a 64-bit processor computer, does that store twice as much information as, let's say, a 32-bit processor? And the answer is no. You are actually, by doubling from 32 to 64, you're actually increasing the number of possible values for zeros and ones exponentially. It's basically like the higher the bit architecture of a computer, the more instructions it can process per second. So let's move down to where it says MacBook Pro 13-inch mid-2012. So this model was released in mid-2012. Interestingly enough, I actually purchased this product in store late 2013. So I guess when they release and when what they have in store doesn't always, like there's some lag time, I guess, there. And then also the 13-inch number refers to the diagonal measurements of the screen, not the black part or the bevel. It doesn't include the aluminum frame. It's only the diagonal measurements, whatever side, of the actual lit screen. Okay, so now let's go down to the processor section. And we see here that I have a 2.5 gigahertz dual core Intel Core i5 processor. So what does all that mean? You can basically think of the processor as the brains of your computer, right? This is the central area where everything is being, executed on your computer. And a hertz basically refers to a rate. Anytime you hear hertz, it means times per second. You could calculate the hertz of your heart rate. You could calculate the hertz of the keystrokes on your computer or your laptop. And as we alluded to before, giga refers to a billion. So this 2.5 gigahertz refers to 2.5 billion hertz, essentially. And basically what this is referring to is my computer is cycling through its clock cycle 2.5 billion times every second. And this goes to an extremely important part about computing. There's nothing smart in your computer. There are no special or magic programs on your computer that make it do what it does. The whole thing behind how computing is so powerful and effective is that it's so quick, it's so fast. My computer, which is a nice computer, but it's not really anything special, is cycling through its core system 2.5 billion times every second. That's really powerful, and that's kind of the point of writing in programming languages, is you're trying to harness this insane speed, and you're trying to wrap it in logic. And obviously, there are really cool things that you can do with that. Let's move down to the dual core part. So a dual core processor is a computer with two processors or two cores in the same integrated circuit, right? So even though it's all one processor, each of these cores has its own cache, its own controller, which enables it to function as efficiently as a single processor. However, because the two processors are linked, they can actually work twice as fast. And again, I'm not going to go into all the details of how that works, but it's just interesting to know that kind of thing. From my research, what I can tell is the higher end of things, people are going up to about 8 cores. And like I said, I'm operating on a dual core. The Intel Core i5 is a really good processor. It's made by Intel. However, they have released new versions called the i7 and the i9. And for example, the i9 has a max turbo frequency of 5.3 gigahertz. So my computer's processing every 2.5 billion seconds. This processor is going to be doubling that. Pretty interesting. Another interesting thing to think about is you would think in the processing world, right? Like this is Silicon Valley. This is sort of like a mature industry. It's been around for a long time. There's a lot of money in this industry, but there are really only 2 processor makers. That is Intel and another company called Advanced Micro Devices. And it's sort of an interesting dichotomy of like you have really just 2 companies making the majority of the processors in the whole world. It's just something to check out and to be interested in. Let's move down to the memory section. My computer is telling me that I have 4 gigs of memory, and it's operating at 1600 megahertz, and it is a DDR3 system. So what does all that mean? So again, we're going to go back to the megahertz principle, and this is saying that our system is going to be cycling every 1.6 million times per second, as opposed to the processor, which is cycling 2.5 billion times per second. So it's just an interesting idea. There are two types of hard drives that a computer uses. It has the RAM, which is random access memory, which is used to get information and data really quickly, right? And then you have another type, which is just the traditional type of hard drive, which runs magnetically and has moving parts on the inside. This is a slower way to retrieve data, but it's much cheaper to make and to buy, right? So a RAM-based, these random access memory systems, they're solid state drives. This is a storage device that is made from silicon microchips. They don't have any moving parts, and they store data electronically as opposed to magnetically with the cheaper but slower traditional hard drives. RAM-based memory are often used in financial, telecom, e-commerce, and other fields where high latency or downtime cannot be tolerated. So you're going to want to use this really quick RAM memory if timing is an issue, right? Or you just need like the best quality stuff. You're going to go for the RAM. It seems like 1600 megahertz is pretty good, but if you want to be on that professional level or you're a really high-end gamer, it seems like the threshold is really 3200 and above. And it seems like if you ever wanted to go over 4000 per se, you would be operating a really like high-end competitive first-person shooter game with a really high refresh monitor rate, right? And then the DDR3, this is just an abbreviation for Double Data Rate Type 3. It's a modern type of dynamic random access memory, which we've talked about, and it uses a high bandwidth or a double data rate interface and has been around since 2007. This is just basically a type of RAM, and it has what's called the double data rate interface, right? The DDR3 is still considered good in 2021. However, the DDR4 technology does exist and does offer some better functionality. It seems like from my research, the higher end of memory tends to hover around 32 gigs. Again, these are for your high-end gamers, individuals working in the financial world that are using a lot of computing resources. They might go for that 16 gig or 32 gig random access memory. And it's interesting to note that actually Apple in their new MacBook Pro offers you the opportunity to get 12 128 gig RAM cards, which add up to a 1.5 terabytes of random access memory, which is just really insane when you consider that we only have 4 gigs. They're operating 1.5 terabytes, right? It's also worth noting that this adds an extra $25,000 to your system, but we'll leave that out for another discussion. Let's hop down to the startup disk, and this is saying that my startup disk is located on the XXX drive, and that basically means that I have a drive on my computer. I named it XXX, and basically the startup disk is a disk that contains all of the startup instructions when your computer is booting, and then once it's done booting, it's going to start opening up your operating system and going from there. All this is saying that those instructions for startup are located on this XXX drive. Let's hop down to the graphics area. I have an Intel HD Graphics 4000 1536 megabyte, right? So the Intel HD 4000 is a fairly decent graphics card, especially because it's from Intel, right? Like it's a great company. Intel, they've made better graphics cards though, right? Like this computer is 8 years old, and since then, especially due to like Apple's prodding for better integrated graphics performance, like it's a good card, but it's not like the cream of the crop. Just like basically all the other features on this computer, they're a little bit outdated. They're not like they weren't like the best at the time, but in 2021, it's pretty good stuff, right? It's not going to be the best. Um, and specifically, Intel's graphics cards, they're not really meant for gaming. They're not like these dedicated graphics cards like that of Video or Radeon, right? And this, I want to like go back a little bit and talk about this idea of a graphics processing unit. This is sort of like the central processor of the computer, but it's only for graphics, right? It's only for the display, for images. And a GPU, or a graphics processing unit, is basically a specialized electronic circuit designed to rapidly manipulate and alter memory to accelerate the creation of images in a frame buffer intended for output to a display device. This is just basically an individual part of the computer that is specifically tuned up for making great graphics and displays, right? It says that their highly parallel structure makes them more efficient than the general purpose CPUs, or central processing units, our processor. They're more efficient for algorithms that process large blocks of data in parallel. And so when the About This Mac page is telling us, oh, you have an Intel HD Graphics 4000, that's a graphics card. And these graphics cards, they're different than the GPU, right? A graphics card is something that you would attach to the GPU to add functionality, and basically this card is specifically suited to make the graphics really good, right? And then lastly, the 1536 megabytes. What does that mean? Well, we know from our early discussions on bits and bytes and things like that, the mega prefix represents millions. The giga prefix represents billions. So if we have 1536 megabytes, we basically have about a gig and a half, right? And so these Intel graphics chips, they use shared memory, which basically means that a gig and a half of our RAM is going to be specifically designated for VRAM, or graphics. So we can say that we have 4 gigs of memory, but a gig and a half is only devoted to graphics. So that's sort of interesting to think about. And then lastly, I'll just go over the serial number. The serial number is basically an Apple number, an Apple identifier that's going to let you know a bevy of information. It's going to let you know where the computer was manufactured, what date it was manufactured, just all kinds of like unique identifying information about your computer that they'll use at the Apple Store, that you could probably use to buy new parts for. So that's my presentation on About This Mac. I hope that you've learned a little bit about computing and how it works, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to make some more videos that'll give you a better idea of what's going on with your computer. Thank you so much.